The servitor collapsed mid-stride, its augmetic legs folding beneath a torso that had been stitched together from 3 separate donors. It hit the marble floor of the Sanctum Imperialis with a wet crunch, and the data slate it carried skittered across polished stone that had been walked upon by saints and traitors alike. No one moved to retrieve it. The 5 custodians standing vigil in that vaulted chamber, each one a demigod wrapped in auramite plate, simply watched as the servitor's remaining organic eye rolled back to show only white. The machine slave had been carrying vital telemetry from the psychic choir that maintained the Astronomican, information that typically demanded immediate action. But none of the Golden Warriors stirred. They were looking at something else entirely. They were looking at him. The God Emperor of mankind sat upon the golden throne, exactly as he had for 10,000 years. His withered form a monument to endless suffering. Cables thick as a man's torso pierced his flesh, feeding him the souls of psykers while simultaneously draining his power to fuel the great beacon that guided humanity through the warp. His face, what remained of it, had long ago become a landscape of scar tissue and exposed bone, a topography of agony that no mortal eye should witness. But now, for the first time since the Horus heresy tore the Imperium in half, something had changed. His eyes, those ancient orbs that had witnessed the birth of civilization and the death of reason, were closed, not squeezed shut in pain, not flickering with dreams. Closed with the peaceful finality of a man who had made a choice. Valdor I, Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes, felt his primary heart stutter in his chest. He had stood in this chamber for millennia, measuring time not in years, but in the slow accumulation of dust on surfaces that servitors cleaned hourly. He had watched the Emperor's face contort in silent screams, had seen psychic fire leak from his tear ducts, had witnessed the slow transformation of a god into something that resembled nothing so much as a battery wrapped in flesh. But peace? Peace was new. Peace was wrong. He took a step forward, his guardian spear humming with barely contained power, and opened a vox channel to the 300 custodians stationed throughout the Imperial Palace. His voice, when it came, sounded hollow even to himself. The throne room is sealed. No one enters. No exceptions. The other custodians in the chamber understood immediately. They moved to defensive positions around the throne, their weapons drawn not to protect the Emperor, but to protect everyone else from what might happen if word of this moment spread beyond these walls. The Imperium was held together by faith, by the belief that the Emperor still fought for them, still guided them, still cared whether they lived or died in his name. If that faith cracked, if 8 trillion souls across 1 million worlds learned that their God had simply stopped, the resulting psychic shockwave would make the age of strife look like a pleasant afternoon. Valdor climbed the steps to the throne, each footfall echoing in a chamber built to amplify the divine. Up close, the Emperor's condition was somehow worse than from a distance. His skin had the texture of old parchment stretched over kindling, so thin that veins showed through like rivers on a map. The life support systems grafted into his body wheezed and gurgled, pushing fluids that might have been blood through tubes that might have been veins. Valdor had memorized every line of that ruined face, every burn scar and las wound, every mark left by Horus's final betrayal. He knew the exact rhythm of the Emperor's breathing, the specific frequency of his psychic emanations, the particular shade of golden light that leaked from his third eye. And now all of it was wrong. The breathing continued, shallow but steady, an autonomic function divorced from consciousness. The psychic emanations still pulsed from the Emperor's body, but they felt distant now, turned inward, flowing away from reality rather than into it. The golden light had dimmed to the faintest glow, barely visible even in the perpetual twilight of the throne room. Valdor reached out with one gauntleted hand, hesitated for just a fraction of a second, and then placed his palm against the Emperor's forehead. The skin felt cold, not the cold of death, but the cold of absence, as if the mind behind that flesh had simply packed up and moved somewhere else entirely. "My lord," Valdor whispered, and his voice cracked on the second word. "What have you done?" The Emperor did not answer. The Emperor had not spoken aloud in 10,000 years, communicating only through psychic impression and the occasional brief flash of vision granted to those he deemed worthy. But even those silent messages had always carried a sense of presence, of attention focused like a laser on the problems of an empire spanning the stars. This was different. This was a door closing. This was a man who had carried the weight of human survival on his shoulders since before the Bronze Age, finally, deliberately, setting that burden down. The Astronomican began to waver 3 hours later. The great psychic beacon that had guided Imperial ships through the warp for 100 centuries started to flicker like a candle in a storm. And across the galaxy, navigators clutched at their third eyes and screamed. On the bridge of the battleship Eternal Vindication, Navigator Prime Cassandra Belisarius felt the beacon stutter and immediately vomited a stream of blood across her star charts. She had been navigating by the Emperor's light since before her great-great-grandmother was born, threading her ship through the Imperium, using that golden beacon as her only fixed point in an ocean of madness. Without it, she was blind. Worse than blind. She was aware. The warp churned outside her ship's Geller field, pressed against that thin membrane of reality like a starving animal against glass. She could feel entities in that roiling chaos, vast intelligences that noticed her noticing them. And in that moment of mutual recognition, she understood with perfect clarity that the only reason those things had not devoured her ship years ago was because something else, something impossibly large, had been standing between them. The Emperor's presence in the warp had not been a beacon. It had been a wall. And now the wall was coming down. "Engage emergency translation to real space." She managed to gasp before another wave of nausea doubled her over. "Immediately. I don't care where we are. Get us out of the warp now." The Eternal Vindication tore back into reality 17 light-years off course, emerging from the Imperium with its hull covered in a thin frost that should not have been physically possible. Similar scenes played out across the galaxy. 10,000 ships, from tiny in-system haulers to cathedral-sized battle barges, suddenly found themselves navigating without guidance. Some made it to safe harbor. Most did not. The warp currents that had been held stable by the Emperor's will began to shift and buckle, and the ships caught in those currents were torn apart by forces that existed in directions human geometry had no names for. But the strangest part, the detail that would obsess scholars and madmen for generations to come, was what replaced the Astronomican. The golden light did not simply vanish. It transformed. Navigators across the galaxy reported seeing a new phenomenon in the warp, a pattern of mathematical precision that seemed to exist independently of chaos, independent of the materium, independent even of thought itself. It was not light, though they described it as luminous. It was not sound, though it seemed to carry information. It was closer to a command, to an instruction written directly into the fabric of reality, telling space and time how they were supposed to behave. Ships that sailed toward this new pattern found their voyages easier, not harder. The warp seemed to smooth out around them, becoming navigable in ways it had not been in millennia. Demons that approached these vessels recoiled as if burned, their immaterial forms unable to maintain cohesion in proximity to that strange mathematical light. Some navigators claimed they could navigate by it more precisely than they ever had by the Astronomican, plotting courses that would have been impossible under the old system. Others refused to look at it at all, insisting that there was something fundamentally wrong about a pattern so perfect existing in a place defined by chaos. On Terra, in a bunker beneath the Imperial palace that appeared on no map and was guarded by mechanisms that predated the Imperium itself, a device began to activate. It had been built during the dark age of technology, repurposed by the Emperor during the Unification Wars, and hidden away with the kind of paranoia usually reserved for doomsday weapons. No one living knew exactly what it did. Malcador the Sigillite might have known, but Malcador had crumbled to dust on the Golden Throne when the Emperor first took his seat, buying humanity one last moment of grace. The device looked like a sphere of perfect silver wrapped in equations that hurt to read, suspended in a gravitic field that made nearby servitors malfunction and gave tech priests splitting headaches despite their augmetic pain suppressors. It had been dormant for 10,000 years. Now it woke. The sphere began to spin, slowly at first, then faster, until it became a blur of motion that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Equations crawled across its surface like living things, each symbol representing mathematical concepts so advanced that they bordered on philosophy. The gravitic field expanded, pressing against the walls of the bunker with enough force to crack the ancient stone, and the air itself began to taste of copper and ozone, and something else. Something that had no name in High Gothic or Low Gothic or any of the 1,000 languages spoken across the Imperium. It tasted like finality. The device had a name, though only one person had ever known it. The Emperor had called it the Godbreaker Protocol, and he had spent 2,000 years perfecting it before the Horus heresy interrupted his work. The principle was elegant in its cruelty. Chaos existed because sentient beings fed it with their emotions, their beliefs, their desperate prayers to powers that would consume them. The Chaos gods were parasites wearing crowns, bloated with stolen worship. They could not be killed by force because force itself was one of their foods. Battle fed corn, despair fed Nurgle, ambition fed Tzeentch, excess fed Slanesh. The Emperor had realized, somewhere in the long centuries of his war against chaos, that the only way to starve them was to remove humanity from the equation entirely. Not by destroying humanity, by changing it, by forcing human evolution down a path that led away from psyker mutation, away from warp sensitivity, away from the emotional extremes that made mankind such perfect prey for the dark gods. But evolution took time, and chaos would not wait patiently while humanity transformed itself. So the Emperor had made a sacrifice. He had sat upon the Golden Throne and held chaos at bay, not by defeating it, but by giving it something to focus on: himself. For 10,000 years, he had been a lightning rod, drawing the attention and hatred of the Chaos gods, while simultaneously feeding them just enough to keep them satisfied, keeping them locked in a stalemate where they could neither win nor lose. It was the grandest and most terrible con in galactic history. And now, finally, it was ending. The sphere in the bunker reached critical speed and exploded outward in a pulse of invisible force that raced through the warp at speeds that made light look stationary. It touched every human soul in the galaxy simultaneously, a quantum psionic rewrite that altered something fundamental about what it meant to be human. Psykers across the Imperium felt their powers simply stop. The connection to the warp, that terrible gift that had allowed them to hurl fire with their minds and read thoughts like books, severed like a cut cable. One moment they were channeling the Imperium, the next they were just people, staring at their hands in confusion as the voices in their heads went silent for the first time since their powers had manifested. On the black ship Purgatory's Oath, 300 captured psykers screamed in unison as the collars around their necks fell open, no longer necessary, because there was nothing left to suppress. The Culexis assassin guarding them felt her own blank field generator sputter and die, rendered obsolete by a universe that had suddenly decided psychic powers were no longer compatible with human biology. She stood there in the darkness of the holding bay, surrounded by sobbing psykers who had spent their entire lives being told they were cursed, and tried to understand what had just happened. The feeling of wrongness that had defined her existence, the soul-deep revulsion that made normal humans avoid her gaze, had evaporated. She was just a woman now. They were all just people. The effect rippled outward from Terra like a stone thrown into still water. Warp storms that had raged for millennia began to dissipate, their energy no longer able to find purchase in real space. The Great Rift, that vast wound in reality, torn open by the birth of Slanesh and widened by 10,000 years of war, began to close. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with the inevitability of a healing scar. Demons manifested in real space found their forms destabilizing, unable to maintain cohesion without the emotional energy they had been feeding on. They flickered like bad hololith projections, their voices fading to whispers, and then they were simply gone, banished not by prayer or bolter fire, but by a universe that had remembered how physics was supposed to work. In the eye of terror, in that twisted realm where chaos reigned supreme and reality was negotiable, the chaos gods felt the change and understood what it meant. They had been played. For 10,000 years they had thought they were winning, slowly corrupting the Imperium from within, feeding on human suffering like bloated ticks. But the Emperor had never been trying to defeat them. He had been buying time, holding them in place while he prepared the one weapon they could not defend against. Withdrawal, starvation, silence. The chaos gods screamed, and their screams shook the foundations of the warp, but there was no one left to hear them. The connection was broken. Khorne watched his legions of demons collapse like puppets with cut strings, their brass armor clanging hollow against the blood-soaked ground of his realm. The blood god had grown fat on 10,000 years of war, had reveled in every battle fought in his name, every skull added to his throne. But war required warriors, and warriors required rage, and rage required living minds to feel it. As human psykers lost their connection to the warp, as human emotions stopped bleeding into the immaterium, Khorne felt himself begin to starve. Not quickly. The reservoir of accumulated power was vast, but inevitably. He tried to manifest more demons, to pour his legions into real space and take by force what was being denied to him. But the demons could not hold their forms. They bubbled and burst like pustules, leaving nothing behind but the memory of fury. Nurgle, grandfather of plagues, felt his gardens begin to wilt. The beautiful decay he had cultivated for eons, the perfect rot that turned death into a celebration, required fear of death to sustain it. But humanity was changing, evolving away from the emotional extremes that made Nurgle's gifts so seductive. The plagues he sent into real space found no purchase. The diseases that should have blossomed in human flesh simply failed to take root, as if the infected bodies no longer recognized them as threats. Nurgle's daemonettes, those beautiful rotting things that whispered comfort to the desperate and dying, found their voices unable to reach mortal ears. They stood in his gardens and wept pus, and their weeping accomplished nothing. Tzeentch, architect of fate, saw his plans unravel. The great conspirator had woven schemes within schemes, had set in motion plots that would not bear fruit for 1,000 years, had placed pieces on the board that would not be moved until stars died and were reborn. But every plan, every scheme, every intricate manipulation had been built on the assumption that humanity would remain psychically active, that the warp would remain accessible, that change itself would continue to be the defining constant of the universe. Now change had changed. The Imperium was smoothing out, becoming stable, approaching something dangerously close to stasis. Tzeentch, whose very nature was mutation and transformation, felt himself beginning to calcify. His demons stopped shifting forms. His libraries of forbidden knowledge began to fade, the words on their pages dissolving like ink in water. He tried to read the future and found it had become opaque, a wall of mathematical certainty that his sorcery could not penetrate. Slaanesh, youngest and perhaps most dangerous of the four, felt pleasure itself begin to dim. The Dark Prince had been born from the death scream of the Aeldari civilization, had feasted on 10,000 years of human excess and despair, and the desperate hedonism of a species that knew it was dying. But excess requires sensation, and sensation requires a nervous system wired to experience extremes. The new humans being born into the Imperium, the children whose genetic code had been rewritten by the Emperor's final gift, did not feel things the way their parents had. They experienced emotions as distant echoes, intellectual concepts rather than consuming fires. They were calm. They were rational. They were everything Slaanesh was not. The Dark Prince tried to seduce them, to offer them pleasures beyond imagining. But the children simply looked at his offers and politely declined. They had better things to do. The Traitor Legions, those space marines who had turned from the Emperor to serve the Chaos Gods, felt the change most acutely. They had remade themselves, had accepted demonic mutations and warp gifts that turned them into something more and less than human. Now those gifts were becoming liabilities. The Chaos Marines of the World Eaters, those blood-mad berserkers who had given themselves to Khorne, found their rage cooling to mere anger, then to irritation, then to nothing at all. They looked at their armor, fused to their flesh by warp corruption, and tried to remember why they had thought this was a good idea. The armor began to crack, the demonic entities bound into the ceramite, unable to maintain cohesion. Warriors who had fought for 10,000 years simply stopped, confused by the sudden silence in their heads. The Death Guard, Nurgle's favored sons, felt their blessed plagues turn against them. The diseases that had kept them in a state of perpetual decay, that beautiful slow rot that had made them impossible to kill, began to progress past the point of stasis. They started to actually die, their bodies finally giving up after millennia of abuse. Some welcomed it. Others fought, trying desperately to hold on to the gifts they had spent 10,000 years earning. But the warp no longer answered their prayers. They collapsed in their armor, and their armor collapsed with them, the ancient ceramite finally succumbing to rust and entropy. The 1,000 Sons, Tzeentch's sorcerers, found their spells failing mid-cast. Ahriman, greatest of their number, stood in his sanctum aboard the planet of the sorcerers and watched 10,000 years of accumulated knowledge become worthless. The grimoires on his shelves burst into flames that consumed the pages, but left the bindings intact, a perfectly symbolic destruction. He tried to cast a simple illumination spell, something any apprentice could manage, and felt nothing. The warp was still there. He could sense it, but it had become like a sea separated from shore by a cliff face, visible but unreachable. He threw back his head and laughed, because the alternative was to scream, and even his laughter sounded wrong in the suddenly quiet chamber. The Emperor's children, Slaanish's chosen, felt their enhanced senses become liabilities. They had spent millennia refining their ability to experience sensation, had pushed human neurology past its natural limits in pursuit of perfect pleasure and perfect pain. Now those refinements were killing them. Their nervous systems, unable to interface properly with a warp that had become incompatible with human biology, began to misfire. Some fell into comas, others seized violently, their bodies rejecting the demonic grafts and warp mutations that had defined them. A few managed to remain conscious, but they reported feeling nothing at all. A sensory deprivation so complete it bordered on torture. They had become ghosts wearing armor, present in the world but unable to interact with it in any meaningful way. In orbit above Terra, the Phalanx, mobile fortress monastery of the Imperial Fists, detected the changes and immediately went to high alert. Chapter Master Vorn Hagen stood on the battle bridge and watched as every astropath in his command fell silent. Not dead, just silent. The psychic choir that had been chanting liturgies of protection for the past 3 centuries simply stopped mid-word, and the sudden quiet was deafening. Hagen was a practical man, a son of Dorn who believed in walls and bolters and the simple application of overwhelming force. He did not trust the warp, had never trusted it, and some small part of him felt relief at its sudden absence. But relief was a luxury he could not afford. Without the Astronomican, without astropaths, the Imperium would fragment. Isolated worlds would become prey. The unity that the Emperor had built, that 10,000 years of blood and sacrifice had maintained, would shatter into 1,000,000 pieces. "Get me a Vox link to the throne world," he ordered. "I need to speak with the Captain General, now." The Vox operator tried, failed, tried again. The communication systems on the Phalanx had been built to withstand anything short of direct orbital bombardment. But they relied on astropathic relay stations scattered across Terra to function at full range. Those stations had gone silent. The operator finally managed to establish a direct laser link, painfully slow but functional, and Hagen found himself talking to a custodian whose name he did not recognize. The Golden Warrior's voice came through the Vox grill flat and emotionless, which was somehow more disturbing than open panic would have been. "The situation is contained. The Emperor lives. The throne is stable. All other information is classified under the Penumbral Protocol. Return to your patrol route and await further orders." The link cut off before Hagen could respond. He stood there on the battle bridge, surrounded by servitors and tech priests and space marines, who were all looking to him for guidance, and tried to decide whether he had just been lied to. The Emperor lives. That was technically true. The Emperor had been living, in the loosest sense of the word, for 10,000 years. But something had changed. Something fundamental. And the fact that the custodians were invoking the Penumbral Protocol, a security measure that had not been used since the Horus Heresy, suggested that whatever had changed was big enough to threaten the entire Imperium. He made a decision. All ships are to maintain current positions. No one leaves orbit without my direct authorization. Send word to our successor chapters. Tell them to prepare for a period of isolation. Tell them... He paused, searching for words that would convey the gravity of the situation without causing panic. Tell them the Emperor has made a move, and we must trust in his wisdom. It was a pretty lie, and Hagen hated himself a little for telling it. But the truth, that he had no idea what was happening or whether humanity would survive the next week, was not something his men needed to hear. They were space marines. They would fight until they died. and if the Imperium collapsed around them, they would fight even harder. But they deserved better than to die confused. On Terra, in the hive cities that housed quadrillions of souls packed into towers that scraped the clouds, the population began to notice something was wrong. The psychic background radiation that every human unconsciously perceives, that vague sense of presence that comes from knowing you are surrounded by other minds, had vanished. People felt isolated in ways they could not articulate, alone even in crowds. Mothers looked at their infants and felt disconnect, as if some essential thread that had always bound parent to child had been severed. Workers on assembly lines found themselves unable to predict their neighbors' actions, resulting in accidents and slowdowns. Street preachers who had spent their lives calling down visions from the Emperor stood on their crates and opened their mouths and found they had nothing to say. The Adeptus Arbites, the Imperium's brutal police force, prepared for riots that never came. The population did not panic. They simply became quiet. Quieter than humans had any right to be. They went about their business with mechanical efficiency, no longer driven by fear or hope or any of the emotions that had historically motivated human behavior. They worked because working needed to be done. They ate because bodies required fuel. They slept because consciousness had its limits. But the spark that made humanity chaotic and beautiful and dangerous had dimmed to almost nothing. In the Scholastica Psycana, the training grounds for sanctioned psykers, the instructors found themselves obsolete overnight. The students who had been learning to control their powers, to channel the warp without being consumed by it, no longer had powers to control. Some took it well, others did not. A girl of perhaps 14, who had spent the last 3 years learning to throw fire with her mind, sat in her cell and stared at her hands and tried to make them burn. Nothing happened. She tried again, and again, and again, until her hands were bleeding from where she had dug her nails into her palms. But there was no fire. There was no power. There was just a frightened child who had been told she was special, was dangerous, was necessary, and who had now been rendered completely ordinary. She began to laugh, and could not stop laughing. And eventually the instructors had to sedate her because the laughter had become screaming, and the screaming would not end. The Inquisition mobilized with the efficiency of an organization that had spent 10,000 years preparing for the end times. Across the galaxy, Inquisitors activated sleeper cells, called in ancient favors, and began investigating what had happened to the psykers under their jurisdiction. The answers they found were consistent and terrifying. Every psyker, from the most powerful to the barely awakened, had lost their connection to the warp. The black ships that harvested unsanctioned psykers found their holds empty. The prisoners released because there was nothing left to imprison. The Inquisitors who specialized in hunting demon hosts and warp-corrupted individuals found their target simply gone, burned out from the inside as the entities possessing them lost cohesion. Inquisitor Lord Covenant, a man who had served the Emperor for 200 years and whose augmetic eyes could see into the Imperium itself, stood in his private chapel and tried to pray. He had always been able to sense the Emperor's presence, that vast golden weight pressing down on reality from his throne on Terra. It had been his anchor, his proof that the Imperium's faith was justified. Now he felt nothing. The Emperor was still there. He knew this intellectually. But the presence had withdrawn so completely, it might as well have been absence. Covenant fell to his knees, and his augmetic knees cracked the marble floor, and he prayed anyway. Because what else was there to do? The answer came not from the Emperor, but from something else entirely. A child walked into the chapel, no more than 5 years old, with eyes that showed no fear and a face that displayed no emotion. Just calm. Just certainty. The child looked at Covenant with those empty eyes and spoke in a voice that sounded wrong, too mature for such a small body. "Father sleeps. We guide now." Covenant reached for his bolt pistol, a reflexive action born from 2 centuries of paranoia, but his hand stopped halfway to the weapon. The child had not moved, had not threatened him, had simply stated a fact and waited to see how he would respond. He lowered his hand slowly, carefully, and tried to understand what he was looking at. The child's aura, visible to his warp sight, was completely blank. Not in the way a Culexus assassin was blank, an active negation of psychic energy. This was different. This was an absence so complete it seemed to negate the possibility of psychic energy ever existing in the first place. "What are you?" Covenant whispered. "Human," the child replied. "New version. Father designed us. Took 10,000 years. We are ready now." "The Emperor designed you?" "Yes. Dormant genes. Activated when Father stopped fighting. We are immune to chaos. Immune to warp, immune to fear. We will guide humanity forward. Father can rest now." The child turned and walked out of the chapel, leaving Covenant kneeling on cracked marble with more questions than his ancient mind could process. He accessed the cogitator network in his fortress, pulling up birth records from across the sector, and found the pattern immediately. Children born in the last 6 months showed genetic markers that had never been observed in baseline humanity before. Sequences that should not have been possible, that combined in ways that violated every principle of evolutionary biology, but which were clearly intentional. Designed. The Emperor had not been simply holding chaos at bay for 10,000 years. He had been waiting for these genes to propagate through the human population, waiting for the moment when enough carriers existed that he could activate them all simultaneously, waiting for the moment when he could finally, mercifully, stop. The Mechanicus detected the genetic shift 17 hours after it began, and immediately convened an emergency conclave of the Fabricator General and his most trusted tech priests. They gathered in the forges of Mars, surrounded by machines that had been old when Terra was young, and they tried to comprehend what their instruments were telling them. The human genome, that sacred template they had spent millennia preserving and cataloging, had changed. Not through mutation, not through corruption. Through activation of sequences that had always been present but dormant, waiting for some trigger that the Mechanicus had never detected because they had not known to look for it. Fabricator General Xanthus 7, more machine than man, ran the analysis 17,000 times and received the same results every time. The new genome was superior to the old in every measurable way. More efficient neural pathways, enhanced immune response, optimized metabolic function, but most importantly, complete immunity to warp corruption. The new humans could not become psykers, could not be possessed, could not even perceive the Imperium in any meaningful way. They were, for all practical purposes, blanks, but without the unsettling aura that made pariahs so disturbing to baseline humans. "The Omnissiah has granted us his greatest gift," Xanthus 7 intoned, his vox grill crackling with something that might have been awe. "He has made us immune to chaos." But some of the assembled tech priests were less certain. Magos biologist Telok, whose understanding of genetics bordered on the heretical, raised an objection that none of the others wanted to acknowledge. If the Omnissiah designed this genetic shift, and if he activated it by withdrawing his presence from the warp, then the logical conclusion is that he intends to remain withdrawn, perhaps permanently. We must consider the possibility that the Emperor does not intend to return to active rule. The chamber fell silent. The implications of Tellock's statement were staggering. If the Emperor had truly withdrawn, if he had completed some grand plan that required his absence rather than his presence, then what was the Imperium supposed to do? 10,000 years of history, of faith, of sacrifice, had been predicated on the assumption that the Emperor was suffering for humanity's sake, that he would one day rise from the golden throne and lead them to victory. But what if that was never the plan? What if the entire Imperium, the endless wars and mindless devotion and oceans of blood, had all been one massive delaying tactic, buying time for this moment? Xanthus 7 processed the question for approximately 3 seconds, which for his enhanced cogitators was an eternity, before delivering his verdict. Then we adapt. The Omnissiah's will is absolute. If he has chosen to guide us through absence rather than presence, then we must learn to walk without his direct supervision. We are the inheritors of his knowledge. We will endure. It was a statement of faith dressed in the language of logic, and every tech priest in the chamber recognized it as such. But no one challenged it. What else could they do? The Eldar were the first xenospecies to understand what had happened, and their reaction was complex. In the craft worlds scattered across the galaxy, Farseers tried to read the skein of fate and found it had become incomprehensible. The Mon-Ki, those brutish younger cousins whose emotions had always been so loud and crude and easy to predict, had suddenly become opaque. The future paths that involved humanity had fractured into a billion possibilities, none of which made sense according to conventional prophecy. Some Farseers interpreted this as humanity's extinction, the species collapsing without the psychic infrastructure that had defined it. Others saw it as transcendence, humanity finally breaking free from the cycle of warp corruption that had plagued it since birth. Eldred Ulthran, oldest and most powerful of the Farseers, stood on the bridge of craft-world Ulthway and watched the great rift begin to close. He had spent millennia fighting to prevent that wound from spreading, had sacrificed millions of lives to hold it stable, and now it was healing without any intervention from him. The Mon-Ki Emperor, that crude barbarian who had never understood the subtleties of prophecy, had done what no Farseer could accomplish. He had changed the rules. Eldrad laughed, a sound so unexpected that his attendants actually jumped, and the laugh held genuine respect. He was playing a longer game than any of us realized. Eldrad said softly, 10,000 years. 10,000 years of agony, holding chaos in place, all so his species could evolve past the need for him. I underestimated him. We all did. In the frozen hell of Kamara, the Dark Eldar felt the shift as a wave of nausea. Their entire civilization was built on feeding off the suffering of others, on using pain and terror to keep Slaanesh at bay. But the new humans did not produce the same quality of suffering. Their pain was duller, less emotionally resonant, less nourishing. Archons and Hyomunculi began hoarding the old stock of human slaves, the ones born before the change, recognizing that they were now a finite resource that could not be replaced. Some suggested raiding human worlds to acquire the old model humans before they died out. Others argued that it was pointless, that humanity had become boring prey, and that the Dark Eldar would need to find new sources of sustenance. In the crypts of tomb worlds across the galaxy, the Necrons registered the shift in human biology and updated their strategic assessments accordingly. The Cetan had always feared psykers, had gone to great lengths during the war in heaven to eliminate warp-based threats. Now humanity had done the work for them, had rendered itself psychically inert through some mechanism the Necron sensors could not fully analyze. Some Necron overlords saw this as an opportunity, reasoning that a humanity without psykers would be easier to harvest and convert. Others were more cautious, recognizing that any species capable of rewriting its own genome on a galactic scale was not to be underestimated. The orcs noticed nothing at all, because the orcs were busy fighting and would remain busy fighting until the heat death of the universe made fighting impractical. Some weird boys reported that their powers felt strange, that the warp had become harder to access. But this was immediately forgotten when a larger war boss showed up and demanded a good scrap. The Tyranids, approaching from beyond the galactic rim, adjusted their bioforms to account for the new human biology, a process that took approximately 4 hours and involved the extinction of several dozen hive ships worth of organisms that were no longer fit for purpose. On Terra, in the throne room, Valdor had not moved in 3 days. He stood at the foot of the golden throne, watching the Emperor breathe, waiting for something to change. His superhuman physiology did not require sleep or food in the short term, could maintain combat readiness for weeks if necessary. But even custodians had limits. He was beginning to approach his. The other golden warriors in the chamber had rotated out, replaced by fresh guards, but Valdor had refused to leave. He could not articulate why. Perhaps because leaving would feel like abandonment. Perhaps because he needed to witness whatever happened next. Perhaps because after 10,000 years of service, of perfect unwavering loyalty, he had earned the right to stand vigil at his master's side. The Emperor's eyes remained closed. The psychic emanations remained turned inward. But something new had begun to happen. The cables and tubes connected to the Emperor's body, those life support systems that had kept him alive for centuries, were starting to detach. Not torn away, just releasing. As if the Emperor's body no longer required them, as if he was healing. Valdor watched in horrified fascination as a cable thick as his arm withdrew from the Emperor's chest, the wound it left behind sealing immediately with flesh that looked less like scar tissue and more like actual skin. "My lord," Valdor whispered, and this time he did not bother to hide the emotion in his voice. "Are you leaving us?" The Emperor's lips moved, the first voluntary motion he had made in 10,000 years, and a sound emerged. Not words, not language. Just a single exhalation that might have been relief, or might have been grief, or might have been both. And then he went still again. But the stillness was different now. More like sleep than stasis. Valdor accessed the Vox network and sent a message to every custodian on Terra, to every Imperial fist in orbit, to every organization and official who had the clearance to receive it. The message was 3 words long. "He is changing." The response was immediate chaos. The Administratum mobilized, trying to impose order on a situation they did not understand. The Ecclesiarchy prepared for either the second coming or the final apocalypse, depending on which faction of priesthood you asked. The Inquisition launched 1,000 investigations simultaneously, trying to determine whether this was divine plan or Xenos plot. And across the galaxy, on 1,000,000 worlds, normal humans looked up at the stars and wondered why their prayers suddenly felt like they were falling on deaf ears. The children knew. The new humans, the ones born with the Emperor's gift encoded in their genes, looked at the adults with their confusion and their fear and their desperate need for guidance. And they understood. Father had been carrying them for as long as they could remember. 10,000 years of suffering, of endless agony, holding back the tide so that humanity could grow strong enough to stand on its own. And now, finally, He had judged them ready. Now finally, he could rest. And if the adults were not ready for this responsibility, if they still needed a god to tell them what to do and how to live, then perhaps it was time for the children to teach them. A girl named Teresa, born on a hive world whose name she had never learned, stood before the local planetary governor and spoke with a clarity that belied her 6 years of age. The Emperor does not command you anymore. The Emperor trusts you to make your own choices. This is the greatest gift he has ever given. Do not waste it. The governor, a man who had spent his entire career following orders handed down from authorities he would never meet, stared at the child and tried to comprehend what she was saying. Freedom? Choice? Responsibility. These were not imperial values. These were dangerous ideas that led to heresy and rebellion. But the child's eyes held no malice, no deception, just an absolute certainty that what she was saying was true. "What if we make the wrong choice?" the governor asked, and his voice sounded small even to himself. "Then you learn," Teresa replied. "Father has been making your choices for 10,000 years. He has earned rest. You have earned the chance to prove you learned from his example." Similar scenes played out across the Imperium. The new children, speaking with voices that carried a strange weight despite their youth, began to spread a message that no priest or commissar or inquisitor had ever dared to preach. The Emperor was not dead. The Emperor had not abandoned them. The Emperor had simply decided that humanity was ready to stand without him. Some accepted this message. Some did not. The Imperium began to fracture along ideological lines that had been waiting to split for millennia. The resurrectionists believed the Emperor needed to be awakened immediately, that his withdrawal was a mistake or a trap or a test that humanity was failing. They gathered in massive rallies, demanding that the custodians revive him by any means necessary, even if it meant sacrificing millions of psykers to jumpstart his consciousness. They believed that humanity without the Emperor's guidance was humanity doomed to extinction. The sleepers believed the opposite, that waking the Emperor would undo his plan, would reset the clock back to zero and waste 10,000 years of suffering. They argued that if the Emperor had wanted to remain active, he would have done so, that his choice to withdraw was the most sacred command he had ever given, and that honoring that choice meant learning to govern themselves. They gathered in quieter numbers, less militant, but no less passionate, and they prepared to defend the Golden Throne from anyone who tried to disturb it. And then there were the heirs of silence, the new children, who claimed no allegiance to either faction because they understood something the adults did not. The Emperor's plan had already succeeded. Humanity had already been saved. Everything that happened from this point forward was simply humanity deciding what kind of species it wanted to be. Valdor watched all of this from the throne room, monitoring Vox reports and data feeds, and felt something he had not experienced in 10,000 years. Doubt. Not doubt in the Emperor. Never that, but doubt in his own purpose. He was the Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes, created to be the Emperor's personal guard, his companions, his most trusted servants. But if the Emperor had chosen withdrawal, had chosen rest, then what was Valdor supposed to guard him from? Sleep? Peace? His own followers who loved him too much to let him go? One of the new children entered the throne room despite all the security protocols that should have prevented it. She simply walked past the guards as if they were not there, and none of them tried to stop her, confused by an intruder who triggered none of their threat assessment criteria. She climbed the steps to the Golden Throne, her small feet making no sound on stone that had witnessed miracles and massacres. And she stood before the Emperor's sleeping form and looked at him with eyes that held no worship, just recognition, just understanding. He was tired, the child said, and it was not clear whether she was speaking to Valdor or to herself. So tired. Imagine carrying the weight of every human soul for 10,000 years. Imagine never sleeping, never resting, never being allowed to simply stop. He did it because he loved us, because he believed we were worth saving. And now he has saved us, and he is tired, and we should let him rest. This is what love looks like. Valdor had killed for less than this, had executed people for even approaching the Golden Throne without authorization. But he found he could not bring himself to move against this child. Because she was right. Because everything she said was true. Because sometimes love meant letting go, even when letting go felt like death. What happens now? Valdor asked, and his voice held a vulnerability that would have shocked anyone who knew him. We build something new, the child replied. Father gave us the tools, gave us the immunity to chaos, gave us the ability to travel the stars without the warp, gave us a galaxy that is finally, slowly becoming safe. What we build with those tools is up to us. That is his final lesson. That is what it means to be human. She reached out and placed one small hand on the Emperor's withered cheek, a gesture so intimate it should have been heresy. And Valdor saw the Emperor's face shift subtly, not awakening, but acknowledging. A father recognizing his daughter. And then the moment passed, and the child stepped back, and she looked at Valdor with those two old eyes. Your burden ends. Ours begins. She left the throne room as easily as she had entered, and Valdor stood there in the golden silence, and finally, for the first time in 10,000 years, allowed himself to weep. Outside, in the galaxy beyond Terra's atmosphere, humanity began its first uncertain steps into a future without a god. Some worlds thrived, some collapsed, some stayed the same. The Imperium, that vast edifice of faith and bureaucracy and militarized religion, began a slow transformation into something else. Not quickly, not cleanly. 10,000 years of institutional momentum does not reverse itself overnight. But change had come, irreversible and complete, and those who resisted it found themselves fighting against a tide that could not be stopped. The Chaos Gods, weakened but not destroyed, withdrew to the deepest parts of the warp and nursed their wounds. They were not dead, could not be killed, not while emotion itself existed. But they had been defanged, rendered impotent in a galaxy where their primary food source had been removed. They would endure, but they would endure in exile, locked away from the Imperium by a wall of mathematical certainty that no amount of warp power could breach. Horus's final victory had been undone. The Emperor's final gambit had succeeded. On Terra, in the throne room, Valdor knelt before the Golden Throne and spoke the words he had wanted to say for 10,000 years. Sleep well, my lord. We will be here when you wake, or we will carry on without you, building the future you dreamed of. Either way, you have earned your rest. Thank you. For everything. The Emperor did not respond. The Emperor was sleeping, truly sleeping, for the first time since he had walked into the throne room and sat down to die so that humanity might live. And in his dreams, perhaps he saw the future taking shape, saw his children finally standing on their own, saw the galaxy slowly healing from wounds that had bled for millennia. Or perhaps he saw nothing at all, lost in the peaceful oblivion that every living being craves, but which he had denied himself for longer than civilizations endure. The Golden Throne hummed softly, its mechanisms reduced to standby mode, no longer draining a god's power to fuel humanity's survival. The Astronomican was gone, replaced by something better. The warp had quieted, becoming navigable through mathematics rather than mutation. And across 1,000,000 worlds, new children were being born, each one carrying the Emperor's final gift, each one proof that 10,000 years of agony had not been in vain. Humanity's long childhood was ending. The age of gods and demons, an endless war against cosmic horrors, was giving way to something stranger, something uncertain, something that required humanity to take responsibility for its own fate. Some would call it heresy, some would call it salvation. But the children, those new humans who had never known a galaxy defined by chaos, simply called it tomorrow. And somewhere, in the infinite silence of a mind too vast for human comprehension, the God Emperor of mankind finally, mercifully, peacefully slept.